It began with footsteps that should never have echoed, a rhythm that did not belong to any festival, feast, or celebration. It was the kind of movement that slipped into the world quietly, unnoticed at first, yet destined to unravel the fragile sanity of an entire city. Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 was already suffocating under unbearable heat, crop failures, swollen bellies from famine, and fear that clung to every street corner like a second shadow. People moved slowly under the blazing sun, and even livestock seemed reluctant to breathe. Yet somewhere between the timbered houses and narrow cobbled alleys, a sound began, soft, repetitive, almost timid. A single pair of feet tapping the ground with increasing conviction, as if compelled by a force the world could neither see nor name. This is the story of the dancing mania, the summer when Europe lost control, when ordinary men and women found their bodies hijacked by an invisible rhythm, when their limbs refused to obey their minds, and when entire crowds stumbled into destructive, unstoppable motion. It is a story that does not begin with a crowd, but with one woman whose name was whispered more with fear than pity, Frau Troffea. Before we descend deeper into this tale of hysteria, suffering, and supernatural terror woven through the fabric of history, welcome to this journey. You've stepped into a world where fear creates its own music and where humanity's darkest psychological shadows dance freely across the past. If you enjoy these stories of strange events and dark history, I kindly invite you to subscribe. Your support lets us continue exploring the forgotten corners of time, the mysteries buried beneath dust, and the events that shaped humanity's strangest chapters. If you like what you hear today, please consider subscribing. Now, let us return to Strasbourg. Frau Troffea stepped out into the blistering street with bare feet, her face devoid of expression, her body rigid yet tingling with internal pressure she could not contain. Witnesses would later swear that her eyes looked distant, as though she were staring at something behind the veil of reality itself, something only she could see. Without a word, she lifted her arms slightly, spread her fingers as if measuring the air, and began to dance. It was not graceful, nor was it joyous. Her movements were mechanical, jerking, desperate, like a puppet whose strings were pulled by a pitiless hand. At first, neighbors simply watched with raised eyebrows and muttered comments, assuming it was a personal outburst of grief or madness. After all, these were hard times. People snapped in quiet ways. But as the minutes stretched into hours, and hours into an entire afternoon, the murmurs turned to unease. The heat radiating from the stones made the air shimmer, yet she danced without pause. Sweat trickled down her temples, her dress clung to her frame, and her feet reddened with every harsh strike against the ground. No random impulse should have lasted so long, and no ordinary woman could have withstood such physical strain. Something was wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. By sunset, a small crowd had gathered. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, peering wide-eyed at the spectacle. Old men leaned on their walking sticks, whispering signs of omens. The city's more pious citizens crossed themselves repeatedly, fearful that this woman might be touched by forces better left untouched. Yet none approached her. They stood back, watching, uncertain if what they witnessed was madness or something darker. As the night settled over Strasbourg, a warm, oppressive darkness that felt heavier than it had in years, Frau Troffea showed no sign of stopping. Lanterns were lit so people could keep a wary eye on her. She danced in the flickering light, her shadow bouncing erratically against walls, stretching and shuddering like a creature fighting to break free from the boundary separating human and non-human. Her husband begged her to come home, pleaded until his voice cracked, but she did not respond. Her feet bled freely now, leaving droplets that darkened the street like a trail of living ink. By dawn, she had danced continuously for nearly 24 hours. Only brief moments of collapse interrupted her, but each time she fell, her arms would twitch first, followed by her legs, and her body would drag itself back into motion as if refusing to surrender. Soon, she was not the only one. Her strange affliction seemed to seep into the minds of others. A young man who had watched her through most of the night suddenly lurched forward and began to mimic her steps. An older woman, trembling and muttering prayers, found her feet moving against her will. By midday, 3 danced beside her, each just as trapped as she was. It spread from person to person like fire chasing dry grass. The townspeople whispered that the devil himself played invisible pipes, luring souls into a frenzy. Others believed famine and fear had finally broken the minds of the fragile. Physicians argued heatedly about overheated blood, while the clergy warned of divine wrath. But no matter what they thought, the dancers continued. Their bodies became instruments of torment, muscles tearing, joints swelling, breath rasping, but the rhythm that only they could hear dragged them onward. Strasbourg's marketplace, once bustling with laughter, bargaining, and the clatter of goods, now stood partly deserted. Merchants stepped away from their stalls to observe the growing cluster of dancers, their expressions a blend of awe and dread. The sound of stamping feet echoed through the square, a syncopated pounding that made even the bravest uneasy. People began avoiding the infected streets, rushing their children indoors. No one wanted to be near those who seemed possessed by a sinister force. By nightfall of the second day, the dancers had grown to more than a dozen. They writhed across the square, twisting under the moonlight. Their chests heaved, their mouths gasped for air, yet they did not stop. Some clawed at the ground, desperate for relief, but their legs continued the unstoppable, torturous rhythm. A few spectators cried, begging someone, anyone, to intervene, but no one knew how. Local authorities tried their best to maintain order. Guards attempted to restrain the worst cases, but dancers slipped from their grasp, thrashing with unnatural strength. Attempts to tie them down failed as ropes chafed bleeding wrists and ankles, and their bodies convulsed violently in resistance. The city was not prepared for an outbreak that defied both logic and faith. Rumors spread faster than news of war. Some claimed that Frau Troffea had cursed the town through witchcraft. Others whispered that she was being punished by a vengeful saint or possessed by a restless spirit. In a city racked with suffering, such stories took root easily. Every day brought more dancers. Every hour deepened the alarm. As the sun rose yet again, now marking the 3rd day of unbroken movement, Strasbourg was forced to confront an undeniable truth. The mania was spreading, consuming body after body with terrifying ease. And the woman who had unwillingly birthed this crisis still danced relentlessly, her strength fading, but her motion unstoppable. No one knew whether this was the beginning of a nightmare or merely the first sign of something far worse. They did not yet understand that the summer of 1518 would become one of the strangest seasons in all European history, remembered not for wars or rulers or plagues, but for the haunting sight of countless bodies moving to a rhythm no ear could hear. Strasbourg was transforming into a stage for chaos, and the first footsteps, bloody, trembling, and unstoppable, had already set the tempo. The city had only witnessed the opening act. The true madness had not yet begun. By the time the sun rose over Strasbourg on the 4th day of the bizarre outbreak, a dreadful truth had settled upon the city like a heavy fog. This was no ordinary madness. This was a force capable of bending bodies into instruments of torment, of stripping people of control and willpower, leaving only motion without meaning. The quiet dread that had begun with a single woman now pulsed through the streets like a heartbeat too rapid to sustain life. people awoke each morning to a sound that grew more unsettling with every passing hour, the relentless pounding of feet against cobblestone, the rasping breath of those who had danced through the night, and the low moans of exhaustion that never seemed to reach the ears of the afflicted themselves. Strasbourg's citizens would lift their shutters with trembling hands, peering down into the streets with the same fear one might feel when observing a wildfire creeping toward their home. The dancers were everywhere now, in the market square, on the bridges, in the churchyard, even in narrow alleys where their flailing limbs scraped against walls and left streaks of blood. By noon, more than 30 people had joined the involuntary dance. Their bodies bent forward as if pushed by invisible hands, their spines arched in unnatural angles, and their skin slick with sweat. Feet cracked open from repeated impact, leaving smudges of red across the stones. Their clothing clung to them in wet folds, and their hair hung in tangled ropes around faces contorted by fatigue. Yet the dance continued, without rhythm, without rest, without mercy. No one could predict who would be next. It might be a baker returning from the mill, a woman drawing water from the well, or a traveler just passing through the city gates. Witnesses described a moment of stillness, a brief pause in breath, before the afflicted person's legs would jerk violently, their arms lift as if pulled, and their body fall into the same torturous steps. It was as if an unseen puppeteer had tightened new strings. The panic grew as families watched loved ones succumb. Mothers clutched their children tightly, forcing them indoors, afraid that simply witnessing the frenzy might somehow taint their minds. Men who had once scoffed at fear now walked hunched with worry, stepping as far as possible from the dancers while whispering prayers under their breath. Even the air seemed to vibrate with tension. Every unusual movement, every flinch, every cough turned neighbors' eyes sharp with suspicion. Strasbourg's physicians, few in number, overstretched from treating famine-related ailments, found themselves dragged into the center of this crisis. They gathered in hastily arranged meetings in guild halls, their robes damp with heat, their minds racing for explanations. Many blamed overheated blood, claiming the summer's oppressive temperature had boiled bodily humors past the point of sanity. They insisted that the dancers needed to move, needed to sweat the illness out. To them, the motion was a symptom of internal imbalance rather than external influence. Therefore, their advice to the city council was disturbing. Do not restrain the dancers. Let them continue. Encourage movement until the fever burns itself out.
This recommendation, though logical to the physicians, horrified the clergy. The priests saw the dancers not as patients, but as souls in peril. They believed these were individuals seized by divine punishment or demonic influence, and to allow the dance to continue was to embrace the will of dark forces. They called for penance, prayer, fasting, and the cleansing rituals of the church. They warned that whatever plagued these bodies was not of earthly nature. The debate between physicians and priests was heated, but ultimately the council sided with the physicians. They were desperate, overwhelmed, and terrified. They clung to whichever explanation seemed easiest to confront. So, under the midday sun, workers cleared spaces in the market square, believing open ground was safer for the dancers than cramped alleyways. The decision was catastrophic. With space to move freely, the dancers spread, filling the square like a wave of convulsing limbs. People attempting to skirt around them found themselves trapped by the unpredictable flailing, forced to take alternate routes that prolonged their fear. Onlookers who ventured too close sometimes found their bodies responding strangely, fingers tingling, knees trembling, chests tightening. Most resisted the sensation, but a few failed. A young apprentice was the next to fall. He had stood beside his master watching the frenzy when his breath hitched and his legs buckled. His master tried to catch him, but the boy slipped free and lurched into the group. The master later swore that he felt a chill pass through him just before it happened, like the cold presence of something unnatural sliding between them. The dancers' suffering intensified with each passing hour. Their feet swelled grotesquely, toes splitting open, leaving streaks of flesh on the stones. Their legs cramped to the point of locking, yet the rest of their body continued to move, pulling at rigid muscles until tendons snapped. Some bit their lips until blood poured down their chins. Others threw their heads back in silent screams, their throats too dry to produce sound. Still, they danced. Even attempts to help them only made things worse. Well-meaning neighbors brought water, placing cups near the dancers' trembling hands. But many could not drink. Their arms jerked too violently. Water spilled over their faces, or cups shattered against the ground when uncontrolled movements knocked them aside. The few who managed to drink did so only in brief spasms before the dance seized them again.
As evening descended, the air filled with an unsettling chorus, panting, thumping feet, and the distant sobs of families watching their loved ones waste away. The city, once vibrant with daily life, now resembled a place under siege. People spoke of the mania with the same dread as plague or war, as though the dance were a living creature stalking its next victims. The authorities, desperate for a solution, attempted different methods of restraint. Some dancers were carried into barns and tied to beams, yet their bodies thrashed so violently that ropes tore into flesh, and the barns echoed with the sound of frantic, involuntary movement. Others were placed in their homes, surrounded by pillows and blankets to prevent injury, but their families soon realized they could not hold them indefinitely. Eventually, many released them back into the streets, where the pressure of other bodies offered some protection. Among the dancers, the physical toll was severe, but perhaps even more terrifying was the psychological unraveling. Those still capable of thought experienced hallucinations that flickered between fragments of guilt, terror, and divine visions. Some described seeing flames licking at their feet, urging them to move faster. Others claimed to feel hands pressing against their backs, shoving them forward. A few later recounted visions of towering figures draped in light or shadow, guiding their dance with gestures invisible to everyone else. The mind, tormented by exhaustion and fear, crafted its own horrors. Strasbourg's citizens began to avoid entire districts. Shops closed, markets emptied. The sound of hammers in workshops grew rare. The city felt abandoned, not by its inhabitants, but by its sense of normalcy. Every passing hour carried the weight of growing helplessness. Fear itself became contagious, spreading silently from home to home. By the fifth day, the dancers numbered over 50. Their movements carved pathways through the city, their footprints smeared with blood, creating unnatural trails. At night, torches cast long shadows over their jerking silhouettes, making them appear as if swarms of restless spirits had descended upon the earth. The more the dancers suffered, the more fervently the crowd believed something supernatural held them in its grip. A sense of doom settled over Strasbourg. The city seemed caught in a struggle between the natural and the unnatural, between what could be explained and what defied all earthly understanding. The dancers were not merely participants in a tragedy, they had become warnings of a hidden force that could shatter order and reason in an instant. As the sixth day dawned, with the dancers still in motion, their bodies disintegrating under the strain, Strasbourg realized that the mania was not fading, it was growing. The city stood on the precipice of something darker, something even the bravest feared to imagine. The bodies that moved without will were only the beginning. Something within the human mind had begun to unravel, and the mania, like a ravenous fire, had no intention of stopping. By the seventh day, Strasbourg no longer felt like a living city. It had become a place suspended between fever and nightmare, where the ordinary rhythms of life were drowned beneath the relentless pounding of human feet. The streets vibrated with tortured motion, creating a pulse that coursed through the walls of homes and seeped into the minds of anyone who dared to listen. The dancers were no longer an isolated spectacle. They were the city's heartbeat, an erratic, frenzied rhythm that echoed through doorways and drifted through open windows at all hours. What made the spectacle even more chilling was the absence of any music. Not a single drum, pipe, or lute accompanied the strange movements, yet the dancers moved as if carried by a thunderous melody only they could perceive. Their feet struck the ground with fierce intensity, each stomp sending ripples across the stones. They danced with eyes unfocused, their gazes directed towards some distant horizon no one else could see. They did not acknowledge shouts, pleas, or cries. Nothing from the real world seemed capable of touching them. The dancers' bodies told a story of brutal endurance. Their clothes were torn, stained with sweat, dirt, and blood. Skin blistered under the sun's merciless glare, peeled in strips, and darkened with bruises from repeated falls. Some collapsed momentarily, gasping for breath, twitching on the ground as if electric currents passed through them. But then, without warning, they would surge upward again, bodies snapping back into the same merciless cadence. The city's priests whispered that souls were fighting to escape bodies that refused to rest. Witnesses described the movements with tones quivering between horror and awe. Limbs flailed like reeds caught in a violent storm, bodies twisted sharply, spines bending in unnatural arcs. Some dancers threw their arms upward as if reaching for invisible figures hovering above. Others spun wildly without control, tangled hair flying, their steps frantic and uneven. The dance was not coordinated, yet the chaos carried an eerie unity, as if each dancer responded to a single hidden conductor. The city council, desperate and exhausted, attempted to act on the physician's recommendation, provide music so the dancers might expel the fever through rhythm. Musicians were ordered, some willingly, others reluctantly, to gather and play in the square. Drummers brought their instruments reluctantly, tapping tentative beats that echoed across the stone. Pipers filled their lungs with trembling breaths, releasing notes that wavered with fear. Lute players plucked strings hesitantly, afraid their music might entice them into the very madness they hoped to cure. For a brief moment, the scene resembled a grotesque festival. Musicians stood on hastily assembled platforms while dozens of writhing figures stamped the ground beneath them. But nothing improved. In fact, the presence of music seemed to fuel the mania. The dancers' movements sharpened, accelerated, became more violent and erratic. Some threw themselves harder into the ground, feet cracking, bones threatening to break. The rhythms grew louder, not from the musicians, but from the dancers themselves, whose stomps intensified into something like thunder. Crowds gathered at a safe distance, standing behind hastily erected barriers. They watched with expressions that ranged from fascination to despair. Mothers hid their children behind their skirts, though many young ones peeked out with wide, terrified eyes. Merchants abandoned their shops, letting goods spoil rather than risk drawing near the chaos. Even thieves stayed away from the square, unwilling to tempt the curse that had stricken so many. The musicians themselves were not immune to the fear. Sweat drenched their clothes despite the shade of the platforms, their fingers trembling as they played. Some stared at the dancers with haunted expressions, as if fearing that their music would bind them to the same fate. A few attempted to flee mid-performance, only to be herded back by guards who insisted that music was the city's only hope for relief. But Strasbourg soon learned that hope was fleeting. The musicians' rhythms faltered, their courage slipping away with every scream and fall. The air smelled of blood and heat-soaked bodies, a nauseating mixture that made even the hardiest soldier queasy. The faint breeze did little to disperse the suffocating humidity rising from the dancers' convulsing forms. In the evening, as the sun sank low and cast the city in copper light, something shifted in the atmosphere. Dancers who had held themselves upright through sheer torment began to sway more violently, their movements collapsing into spasms. The music ceased abruptly when one drummer dropped his instrument and fled, leaving the others stunned and unwilling to continue. Without accompaniment, the silence around the dancers felt heavier, stranger, as though the unseen rhythm grew louder in the absence of human sound. Some dancers began clawing at the ground, their fingers bleeding as they dragged themselves in feverish circles. Others struck walls repeatedly, as if trying to break free of their own bodies. A few collapsed entirely, their limbs still twitching, their eyes vacant and rolled upward. Guards dragged limp dancers to the edges of the square, piling them under makeshift tents where mothers wailed and families prayed over their trembling forms. But even then, many of the fallen shivered and kicked, unable to fully escape the rhythm within.
Strasbourg was beginning to crumble emotionally. People who had once watched quietly from afar now refused to leave their homes, barricading doors with whatever furniture they had. Windows remained shuttered even in the sweltering heat. The constant pounding of feet kept everyone awake, the sound impossible to ignore. At night, the city seemed trapped inside a nightmare, without darkness to hide the movements, without silence to soothe fear. The dancers moved in clusters now, their erratic paths forming patterns across the square. The ground, once clean, was smeared with blood and dust, forming a grim tapestry under the flickering torchlight. Some dancers moved toward the church unconsciously, their steps dragging them up its steps before they collapsed against the cold stone, trembling. Priests refused to bring them inside, fearing that to do so was to invite corruption into the house of God. Instead, candles were placed near the entrance, illuminating the convulsing figures with an otherworldly glow. As the mania grew, so did the city's dread. Many began to believe that Strasbourg had been cursed. Some whispered that the river had carried a malevolent spirit into the city. Others muttered about a forgotten saint whose wrath had been provoked by the people's pride or neglect. Superstition curled through the air like smoke from a dying fire, impossible to dispel with reason. The families of the afflicted suffered the greatest torment. They watched helplessly as loved ones danced themselves toward death. They tried offering water, food, prayers, charms, anything that might ease the suffering. But nothing reached the dancers. Not love, not words, not physical restraint. Mothers sat beside their children as they convulsed on the ground, whispering lullabies to ears that could not hear. Husbands supported wives until their own legs gave out, yet the mania tore wives from their arms like a force of nature. The emotional devastation fractured households, leaving behind grief deeper than most plagues had caused. One particularly harrowing morning saw a group of dancers collapse simultaneously, their bodies forming a tangled heap. For a brief moment, silence fell over the square. No one moved, no one breathed. But then, one by one, the dancers twitched, shuddered, and rose again, as though pulled upward by invisible threads. The crowd watching recoiled in horror, some falling to their knees in tears. The clergy called it possession, the physicians called it hysteria, but to the ordinary citizens it was something far worse. It was a sign that the mania had no intention of ending.
As more days passed, the city's identity shifted. Life before the outbreak felt distant, buried beneath the constant reality of the dancers. The marketplace that once rang with conversation now echoed with frantic footsteps. Churches overflowed with people seeking solace, yet the priests themselves seemed shaken. Homes that once housed laughter now muted their walls with fear. The mania became the invisible master of Strasbourg, dictating the people's routines, thoughts, and dreams. Even those untouched by the dance found their sleep shattered by nightmares of their own legs moving without will. Some woke in cold terror, convinced they felt the first pull of the unseen rhythm. And throughout it all, the dancers continued, trapped in a torment that offered no rest, no logic, no escape. Their bodies had become arenas of suffering where the human spirit struggled violently against the demands of some inexplicable force. The rhythm had claimed them, a rhythm no one else could hear, a rhythm that threatened to claim the entire city. The worst was yet to come. By the second week of the outbreak, Strasbourg existed in a state of trembling anticipation, as if the entire city stood on a precipice, waiting to see which part of reality would crumble next. The dancers continued their relentless movements, but something far more insidious had begun to spread. Fear, deep and contagious, seeped into every home and mind like rising floodwater. It pooled in alleyways, lingered behind closed doors, and whispered at night through even the smallest cracks in the city's defenses. If the dancer's limbs were the visible manifestation of the mania, the silent heartbeat keeping it alive. Fear began to guide the city's behavior in ways both subtle and profound. Merchants who once shouted prices and bargained boldly now whispered to their remaining customers, glancing constantly over their shoulders. Bakers placed bread outside their doors and retreated quickly, unwilling to stand on the street longer than necessary. Families who owned livestock kept their animals indoors, terrified that the unpredictable movements of a cow or goat might mimic the twitch of a dancer and trigger panic. Even the church bells, once the steady guardian of daily life, rang more hesitantly, as if the bell ringer himself feared drawing the dancers' attention. The dancers had reached more than 100 now, their movements unpredictable, spreading across multiple districts. The city council struggled to keep order as more streets were set aside for the afflicted to move through freely. Barriers were constructed in haste, using wooden beams, hay bales, and anything else that could slow the dancers' erratic paths. But the more space they were given, the more the mania seemed to expand. It was as if fear itself fed the outbreak, granting it strength, direction, and momentum.
Families who once gathered to watch the dancers now hid behind shutters, hearts pounding whenever footsteps approached. Rumors sprouted like weeds in the minds of the fearful, each story darker than the last. One tale claimed that the dancers had seen ghostly figures pulling their arms like marionettes. Another insisted that a cursed wind had blown into Strasbourg from the mountains, carrying madness within its breath. Some whispered that the entire city had been marked by divine punishment, its sins gathered into a single unbearable burden. The priests warned that the mania spread not through air or water, but through sight and thought. They believed that witnessing the suffering could unravel the mind, allowing darkness to slip inside. They urged citizens to remain indoors, pray, and avoid the dancers at all costs. Their sermons grew more impassioned, their voices cracking with fear of spiritual corruption. They warned that watching the afflicted too long might invite the same invisible force to seize one's heart and limbs. Yet despite these warnings, some people could not resist the pull of curiosity. They peered through cracked shutters or climbed onto rooftops to watch from afar. And often, the more they watched, the more the strange unease began to gnaw at them. Fingers twitched, legs tingled, sweat gathered at the back of their necks. Most shrugged the sensations off as nerves, but a few found their bodies responding in ways they could not control. A tremor in the leg became a twitch became a jerk, and soon enough another body would stagger toward the dancers, drawn as if into a storm's vortex. Fear had become the disease. It did not simply live in hearts, it multiplied. It incubated quietly in the mind until the thoughts themselves became infected. Each frightened whisper was another crack in the city's spirit. Each rumor another match tossed into a forest already dry with terror. Panic spread faster than the dance, turning even rational people into trembling shadows of themselves. As more citizens succumbed, the council grew desperate.
Their attempts to contain the dancers had failed. Their alliances with the physicians yielded no improvement. Their reliance on the clergy produced only more fear. Now they faced a far deeper problem. Strasbourg's emotional fabric had begun to tear.
Children were the most vulnerable to this hidden contagion. Many could not fully comprehend the horror they witnessed, yet their bodies mirrored the tension around them. Some clung to their mothers for hours, refusing to sleep unless someone held them tightly. Others lay awake at night, listening to the rhythmic pounding outside, their young minds imagining monsters or spirits dragging people away. A few began to mimic the dancers in small ways, hopping restlessly or shaking their arms without understanding why. Parents, terrified, slapped their hands away or pulled them into tight embraces, whispering desperate reassurances. Elders, too, felt the grip of fear. Those who had lived through wars, plagues, and harsh winters claimed that this outbreak was unlike anything before. They could understand disease, famine, or even death, but a force that compelled bodies to move without reason, this was unfamiliar, unnatural, unmanageable. Many confined themselves to their homes, staring at flickering candle flames for comfort, afraid to even glance outside. The psychological strain began to manifest physically. People reported sudden headaches, dizziness, or weakness in their limbs, symptoms that mirrored the earliest stages of the dance. Some rushed to the church, begging priests to cleanse them with holy water. Others visited physicians, claiming they felt the dance trying to take root inside them. The physicians, overwhelmed and exhausted, offered herbs and tonics with little faith in their effects. Every cough, shiver, or tremor became cause for alarm. People grew suspicious of neighbors, terrified that simple nervousness might mark the beginning of the madness. It became harder to distinguish between actual illness and the effects of fear. As paranoia grew, even the healthy found themselves doubting their stability. The dancers no longer needed to move through the streets to spread their influence. The mere idea of the mania was enough to unravel minds. The behavior of the dancers themselves seemed to evolve as the emotional climate worsened. Their movements intensified, becoming more violent, more unpredictable. Some began leaping and twisting in ways that defied logic, as if their bodies no longer obeyed earthly limitations. Others collapsed more frequently, their limbs convulsing in tight, frantic patterns that mirrored seizure-like episodes. A few let out wrenching cries between gasping breaths, sounds so jarring they echoed in the nightmares of those nearby. It soon became clear that the dancers were suffering not only from physical torment, but also from profound psychological terror. Their movements grew frantic when the crowd's fear peaked, as if they sensed the panic around them and absorbed it into their bodies. The dancers became mirrors of the city's emotional state, amplifying the dread until it hung over Strasbourg like a storm charged with lightning. And then came the first deaths. Bodies that had moved relentlessly for days finally collapsed into stillness. The limbs fell limp. Their chests ceased to rise, and their bloodied feet no longer scraped against the stones. When the first dancer died, a wave of silence rippled across the square. People gasped, some cried out, others fell to their knees. The priests rushed forward, crossing themselves rapidly, murmuring prayers for the lost soul. But death did not stop the mania. It spread more rapidly in the days that followed. Each new death deepened the city's collective fear. Each body carried away on wooden boards made people grip their own arms more tightly, checking for tremors. Each funeral procession drew more tears, more prayers, more whispered worries that Strasbourg had been abandoned by both science and heaven. Fear had become a second epidemic. Invisible, unpredictable, unavoidable. And it was this fear that created the perfect conditions for the mania to spread with unstoppable force.
As terror filled the city's air like a suffocating mist, more people fell into the dance, not because they wanted to, not because they were cursed, but because their minds, strained to the edge of breaking, surrendered to the psychological storm. By the end of the second week, Strasbourg was no longer a city. It was a reflection of mass panic, a place where people feared their own shadows, where thoughts became threats, where bodies betrayed their owners, and where reason crumbled under the weight of collective hysteria. The invisible rhythm that guided the dancers had found its true fuel. And Strasbourg, trembling under summer heat and spiritual dread, was only just beginning to understand how deep the madness ran. Strasbourg had reached a breaking point, not simply because of the dancers who writhed uncontrollably through its squares, but because the city itself had become a battleground of explanations. Every authority, physicians, clergy, scholars, and common citizens fought to claim understanding over an event that defied all logic. As more bodies collapsed, more feet bled, and more minds unraveled, the desire to comprehend the madness grew desperate. Humanity cannot endure terror without explanation. People would rather accept a terrifying answer than none at all. And so, Chapter 5 belongs to the theories, scientific, supernatural, and deeply human, that sought to give reason to a crisis spiraling into the unimaginable. The physicians of Strasbourg were the first to defend their ground. Rooted in ancient beliefs from Galen and Hippocrates, they saw the world through the lens of bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To them, every ailment stemmed from imbalance. In this case, they argued that the dancers suffered from overheated blood, the so-called hot blood fever, a condition born of extreme temperatures, poor diet, and emotional stress. They believed the summer heat had cooked their humors into frenzy, overheating their minds until movement became the only release.
This theory gained traction because the summer was indeed brutal. The heat clung to the city like a suffocating cloak. Wells ran low, food rotted quickly, and the smell of decay lingered faintly in the air even before the dancers arrived. The physicians insisted that allowing the dancers to continue moving was crucial. Sweat, they argued, would cool the blood. Motion would purge the fever. It was this belief that led the authorities to provide musicians, thinking structured rhythm would help guide the fever out. But instead of healing the dancers, music only intensified their frenzied movements. What the physicians failed to understand was that no amount of sweat, no pounding drum, no flute's wail could cure what plagued Strasbourg. The dancers' bodies did not respond to ordinary remedies because the cause was far from ordinary. While the physicians held tight to their humoral theories, the clergy saw the mania through a far darker lens. To the priests, the dancers were victims of supernatural invasion, gripped by demons or cursed by the wrath of Saint Vitus, a saint long associated with protection from neurological disorders and often invoked when tremors or spasms afflicted the body. The irony was not lost on them that a saint known for preventing involuntary movements might also be capable of inflicting them. The clergy interpreted the dancers' violent movements as penance delivered from heaven. Perhaps the city had sinned collectively. Pride, greed, neglect of the poor, or blasphemies whispered behind church doors. Or perhaps, they argued, individuals had brought curses upon themselves through immoral behavior. In either case, the solution to the clergy was clear: repentance, confession, pilgrimage, prayer, isolation from secular influence. Some priests preached that the dancers were possessed, their bodies used as vessels to display divine anger. Others went further, claiming Strasbourg had become a battlefield for unseen spirits. They warned that each dancer was a message, a reminder that God's gaze had turned toward the city. People flocked to churches more than ever, desperate to show devotion, desperate to avoid becoming the next victim. But the clergy, like the physicians, were limited by their own worldview. Their theories soothed the frightened,
but they offered little practical relief. The priests refused to approach dancers for fear of spiritual contagion. They sprinkled holy water from afar, but none dared step too close to those whose limbs thrashed in unpredictable arcs. They prayed loudly, but the dancers' bodies paid no heed. Between science and spirituality, the city found itself torn. When explanations fail, fear expands to fill the gaps. And so the citizens themselves crafted their own theories, stories born of whispers, superstitions, and sleepless nights.
Some believed the dancers had eaten tainted grain, poisoned by strange fungi that grew in times of humidity and hunger. They whispered about bread that carried madness, bread that made limbs jerk and minds collapse. This idea gained quiet support from farmers who had seen odd growths on their stored grain during wet seasons. They spoke of cattle that acted strangely after consuming moldy feed. But such ideas remained only murmurs. Most people did not dare to question the bread that kept them alive in difficult months. Others believed the mania had been conjured intentionally. Rumors spread of witches casting spells in the forest, cursing the city in revenge for persecution. Some even claimed to see figures dancing at night among the trees, mimicking the tortured movements of the afflicted. Whether real or imagined, these sightings fueled paranoia. Women who lived alone or behaved strangely suddenly found themselves under suspicion. One story claimed that strange lights had hovered over the river days before the first dancer fell. Another insisted that a shadowy figure had been seen near Frau Troffea's home the night before she began to dance. Each rumor added another layer of dread, another fracture in the city's fragile stability. In truth, none of these theories were entirely convincing, yet every person clung to whichever explanation granted them the slightest sense of control. The most unsettling possibility, the idea that the mania spread simply through fear, was too terrifying to accept. But the theories began to clash violently. Physicians accused the clergy of worsening the hysteria with talk of demons. Clergy accused the physicians of arrogance and blindness to spiritual truth. Citizens blamed both groups for the city's lack of relief. Arguments erupted in the council chambers, in taverns, on street corners. Everywhere people gathered, theories filled the air like swarming insects. The city council, weary from weeks of crisis, tried to mediate, but the divide only widened. They struggled to enforce any single approach as pressure mounted from all sides. Some demanded more music, believing rhythm could drive out the affliction. Others begged for exorcisms. A few insisted on isolating the dancers entirely, even proposing sealed zones or abandoned buildings where the afflicted could be confined. But no one could risk touching them.
Meanwhile, the dancers themselves endured a nightmare that no theory could alleviate. Their bodies bore the brunt of all suffering, each movement tearing into muscle, each collapse bruising bone. The physicians' claims of overheated blood felt hollow when dancers fainted from exhaustion, yet rose again like puppets pulled upright by unseen strings. The clergy's talk of sin rang equally hollow to families who had known their loved ones as gentle, good-hearted people. The clash of theories did not stop the outbreak. Instead, they intensified the fear. They fueled the emotional fire that burned beneath the surface of Strasbourg. Every new explanation was another match tossed into the dry woods of panic. And as theories multiplied, so did the number of afflicted. By the third week, hundreds had joined the dance. The city felt crushed under the weight of its own confusion. People wondered if any explanation, scientific or spiritual, could possibly encompass the horror they were witnessing. And the more they questioned, the more powerless they felt. The dancers moved as if caught between worlds, flesh bound to earth, minds trapped in invisible storms. They were living contradictions, both victims and symbols of forces no one truly understood. Doctors saw disease, priests saw demons, citizens saw curse, scholars saw hysteria, but none saw the whole truth. The mania was not merely an affliction of the body, it was a rupture in the psyche of an entire city, a mirror reflecting its deepest fears, a crisis fed not only by suffering but by the very attempts to explain it. And in this confusion, Strasbourg teetered on the edge of collapse. The worst theories had yet to arise, the deadliest decisions had yet to be made, and the mania, fed by belief and fear alike, was only gaining strength. As July deepened, the heat over Strasbourg thickened into something almost sentient. It pressed against skin, clung to clothing, soaked through walls and crawled into lungs until breathing felt like inhaling warm sand. Even without the mania, the city would have struggled under the weight of such oppressive weather. But with the dancers pounding across the cobblestones day and night, the heat seemed amplified, fed by the relentless friction of hundreds of feet striking stone. By the 22nd day of the outbreak, the city no longer merely feared the dancers, it feared the nights themselves. Nights had become the realm of whispered horrors, a time when the dancers moved with a strange, feverish intensity that defied all expectation. Whatever force possessed them seemed to grow stronger after sunset, as if the darkness gave it permission to stretch its limbs, breathe and inhabit the spaces daylight forbade.
The night the city trembled began like many before it. Thick air, restless wind, and a sky that glowed red along the horizon as if stained by embers far beyond human sight. The sun had barely dipped when the dancers surged with renewed vigor. Their bodies jerked violently, each movement sharper, more chaotic, like marionettes yanked by an impatient puppeteer. Their feet struck the cobblestones with such force that dust rose in faint clouds around them. Anyone who watched could see the dancers were not simply moving, but convulsing in rhythmic torment. The sound that emanated from the main square became a dreadful percussion. 100 feet pounding in erratic cadence created a thunderous rumble that vibrated through the wooden beams of houses and rattled shutters. People inside their homes clutched their bed frames, their hearts racing with each tremor. When children asked why the earth shook, mothers whispered calming lies, but their eyes betrayed fear far beyond anything they admitted aloud. The city had never before felt alive in such a grotesque way. The ground itself seemed to pulse with movement, as though the mania had seeped into stone, awakening something primal beneath the streets. Witnesses described the dancers that night with trembling voices for years afterward. Their movements had taken on a ferocity that bordered on supernatural. The afflicted tossed their heads violently, hair whipping through the air like frayed ropes. Their arms slashed the empty space around them, carving invisible patterns. Their legs kicked outward with the force of a horse in panic, often striking nearby bodies and sending dancers collapsing, only to rise again moments later. Their faces were the most terrifying of all. Eyes rolled upward until only pale whites showed. Mouths hung open in silent screams, gasping for breath but unable to form words. When breath did escape, it came out in broken gasps, guttural groans, and strange hissing noises that echoed across the square like the lamentations of lost souls. Around the edges of the square, lanterns flickered in the thick air, casting erratic shadows across the dancers. These shadows stretched and twisted, merging together into monstrous silhouettes that crawled across walls and rooftops. To those who watched from windows, it appeared as though the dancers were not alone. Dark, distorted figures seemed to mimic their movements, growing and shrinking with each flicker of firelight. These illusions fed the deeper terror of the night. The clergy, already shaken by the uncanny persistence of the mania, claimed that spirits had descended upon Strasbourg. They believed that what people saw flickering behind the dancers were demons echoing the movements of their hosts. Their claims spread like sparks in dry grass, igniting fear in every household. That night, the city prayed more fiercely than ever before, candles flickering in windows like desperate beacons. Yet even prayer could not drown out the sound of the dancers.
The pounding continued without pause. Some swore the earth trembled under the force of it. Walls groaned, wooden doors shuddered, loose stones rattled out of place. Dogs howled until their throats were raw. Horses in stables kicked at their stalls in blind panic, sensing something unnatural in the air. As the hours passed, the dancers showed no sign of fatigue. Their bodies moved with a momentum that seemed to defy biology. Muscles should have torn, bones should have broken, hearts should have stopped from strain. Yet the dancers persisted, as if animated by something beyond flesh and blood. Those tasked with keeping watch over the afflicted were themselves crumbling. Guards leaned against spears, their faces pale and dripping with sweat. They could hardly bear to look at the tormented figures in the square. Even the most hardened soldier felt fear claw at his chest when a dancer suddenly collapsed, only to rise again moments later, limbs jerking violently in the torchlight. Beyond the square, the contagion of fear rippled through the city. Every household had its own rituals to keep the mania away. Some hung sprigs of herbs above doors. Others placed bowls of water or bread offerings to ward off wandering spirits. Some families recited prayers all night long, voices hoarse by sunrise. But none of these actions eased their terror. Mothers sat awake with children curled in their laps, rocking gently to drown out the pounding. Fathers paced behind locked doors, gripping tools or kitchen knives, not to attack, but because holding something solid made them feel anchored to reality. Elders huddled in corners, whispering ancient stories about curses, madness, and dark omens that once plagued the world. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind against the shutters made them jump. Outside, the dancers became more reckless. Some threw themselves violently to the ground, rolling and convulsing before leaping back to their feet. Others slammed against walls, leaving streaks of blood. A few clawed at their own faces, leaving scratches and gouges that dripped crimson down their necks. Despite this, their movements never stopped. The rhythm, silent and unseen, drove them to continue. At one point during the night, a sudden collective scream rose from the square, low, guttural, and utterly inhuman. Windows slammed shut across the city. Some families fell to their knees, convinced the end of days had come. But the sound did not repeat. It vanished as abruptly as it emerged, swallowed by the relentless beating of feet against stone. By this point, even skeptics felt their confidence crumble. Physicians who once insisted on natural causes now doubted their own explanations. They watched the dancers with trembling hands, unable to understand how bodies could withstand such torment. Some reported feeling dizzy, nauseous, or lightheaded after prolonged observation. They wondered quietly if the mania could spread through more than sight, perhaps through the air, the earth, or something far more intangible. The clergy, too, faltered. Younger priests who had once spoken boldly now muttered prayers under their breath, unable to mask their terror. Older priests, though outwardly composed, showed cracks beneath their certainty. They sprinkled holy water with shaking fingers, their voices wavering as they recited ancient chants. The truth was unavoidable. Even the most devout could not claim control over the nightmare unfolding around them. As the night wore on, exhaustion crept into every corner of Strasbourg, every corner except the square. The dancers moved relentlessly, driven by a force that refused to tire. The sound of their movements became hypnotic, almost trance-like, drawing the city into uneasy wakefulness. Sleep became a luxury few could afford. Even those who closed their eyes found themselves haunted by phantom rhythms, their hearts beating in sync with the distant thundering. But the true climax of the night, the moment Strasbourg would remember with horror, came just before dawn. A sudden silence. Not the silence of rest, not the silence of exhaustion, but the silence of absence. For a brief, terrifying moment, the pounding stopped. The city held its breath. Windows opened cautiously. Guards stared into the square with wide, horrified eyes. The dancers had frozen in place. Some were bent backward, spines arched. Others knelt with arms outstretched. Some leaned forward, trembling, as though about to launch into another movement. Their chests rose and fell rapidly. Their eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, but they did not move.
Then, as if a single unseen hand pressed downward on the earth, dozens of dancers collapsed simultaneously. Bodies hit the ground with wet thuds. Dust rose in clouds. Cries erupted across the square. People screamed. Guards rushed forward. Priests stumbled into the open in shock. Families threw open doors, convinced the nightmare had ended. But it had not ended. The dancers lay still only for a moment. And then, as though each one were pulled by a separate set of invisible strings, they began to rise again, jerking upright, limbs snapping into motion, faces contorted with new intensity. The city trembled one final time, and Strasbourg understood that the mania was far from finished. By late July, Strasbourg had become a city suspended between desperation and surrender. The mania had grown into something almost mythic, an affliction that no physician could cure, no priest could quell, no authority could restrain. Bodies continued to jerk and convulse through the streets in maddening rhythms. The square throbbed with movement day and night, and the air trembled with the relentless percussion of exhausted feet striking stone. The council, crushed under the weight of endless failures, turned its eyes to a solution that was neither medical nor rational, but rooted deep in medieval belief: pilgrimage. If the city itself was cursed, perhaps escape, temporary or permanent from its boundaries, might be the only path to salvation. And so the idea formed like a fever dream. The dancers would be taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus. The decision came not from certainty, but from despair. Saint Vitus, the very saint associated with preventing or inflicting afflictions of the limbs, spasms, and fits, was known across the region as a protector against involuntary movement. People suffering from seizures, tremors, or strange bouts of nervous motion often sought his shrine for relief. Now the council hoped that the same saint who guarded trembling bodies might have mercy on Strasbourg's suffering souls. The clergy embraced the plan with fervor. To them, the shrine represented holy ground, where spiritual corruption might weaken, where the saint's relics might calm the dancers' frantic limbs. But the decision sparked quiet fear as well. If the dancers were truly possessed, moving them beyond the city meant exposing neighboring lands to the same darkness. Yet Strasbourg had no choice. Its own streets would soon collapse under the weight of suffering.
Preparations began at dawn, on a day already soaked in heat. Priests walked through the streets carrying incense burners, swinging them gently to purify the air. The scent of burning herbs drifted through alleyways, mingling with the sour odor of sweat, dust, and blood. Families emerged from their homes cautiously, watching as clergy marked certain routes with chalk, paths for the dancers to follow. But convincing the dancers to walk voluntarily was impossible. Their bodies remained enslaved to the invisible rhythm that forced them to dance. So the council instructed guards and volunteers to create a moving boundary, human barriers guiding the dancers forward while avoiding direct contact. Boards were placed strategically along streets, creating narrow passages that channeled the dancers in the intended direction. The departure began when the morning light cast long shadows across the square. The dancers moved like a single disjointed organism, flailing limbs, jerking torsos, trembling heads. Some slumped forward, barely conscious, yet still driven to move. Others stumbled with unnatural vigor, legs kicking outward in frantic arcs. Their feet left smeared trails of blood across stones that had already been stained from weeks of torment. Priests led the way, chanting prayers that echoed through the city like low, trembling waves. Their robes fluttered in the warm breeze, and some held large wooden crosses aloft, hoping the symbols might shield the group from unseen forces. Citizens watched from windows, holding children tightly as the macabre procession passed. For many, it was the most haunting sight they had ever witnessed. A long river of bodies, convulsing, trembling, flailing, winding slowly through Strasbourg, guided not by their own wills, but by an impossible force. And behind them followed a trail of families begging quietly for miracles. The journey toward the shrine was treacherous. The dancers stumbled frequently, tripping on uneven stones or collapsing under exhaustion. Each fall sent ripples of panic through the guards. Some dancers lay twitching on the ground for several moments before arising again, pulled upright by unseen strings. Others rolled unintentionally, scraping skin until dust and dirt clung to open wounds. The pace was agonizingly slow. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth, forcing sweat into eyes and deepening the agony of every step. But the clergy urged them onward, convinced that holy ground would break the curse.
As the procession neared the edge of Strasbourg, the city's noise softened. The paved stones gave way to packed earth, and the countryside opened before them. Wheat fields stretched outward like waves of gold under the oppressive sun. The shrine lay several miles beyond, perched near a wooded hill where pilgrims often gathered for blessings. But the journey had only begun. The dancers, accustomed to the solid surfaces of the city, struggled on uneven ground. Their movements became even more chaotic as their feet slid on dust and grass. They stumbled across roots, splashed through shallow streams, and collided with one another in spasms of disorientation. Yet the rhythm within them never softened. If anything, distance from the city seemed to intensify their movement, as though the affliction thrived in open air. Villagers along the route reacted with horror when they saw the procession approach. They barred doors, shuttered windows, and whispered prayers from behind walls. Some stood frozen in their fields, tools dangling from their hands, unable to look away from the grotesque river of dancers moving toward the shrine. Fear spread with the procession. Rumors raced ahead of them, talk of cursed bodies, of demons slipping into the countryside, of a plague born not from disease, but from despair. Some families fled their homes entirely, unwilling to risk proximity to the afflicted. But the dancers marched on. When they finally reached the hill of St. Vitus, many were near collapse. Their bodies glistened with sweat, their clothes hung in damp tatters. Their breaths rattled like old bellows struggling to draw air. Some could no longer even form expressions. Their faces slackened into masks of exhaustion, eyes hollow and unfocused. The shrine sat within a small stone chapel. Its walls were adorned with faded paintings depicting the saint saving tormented souls from strange maladies. The doorway offered shade and symbolic shelter, a contrast to the relentless sun. The clergy guided the dancers inside in waves. The air within was cooler, scented with incense and wax. A statue of St. Vitus stood at the far end, illuminated by flickering candlelight. Beneath it lay a reliquary said to contain fragments of the saint's bones. Priests believed this was the key. The dancers needed to come face to face with the relics. They needed to submit themselves physically and spiritually to the saint's mercy. Perhaps proximity to divine remains would sever the invisible strings binding their limbs. The clergy performed rituals with fervor. They sprinkled holy water on the dancers' foreheads, chests, and trembling limbs. They pressed relics close to their bodies. They recited prayers in Latin, voices rising in desperate harmony. Some dancers collapsed during these rituals, their movements slowing momentarily as though the saint's touch brushed them. But the stillness never lasted. Moments later, limbs twitched, legs jerked, bodies spasmed back to life. Some priests stepped backward in shock. Others persisted, driven by faith even as doubts gnawed at the edges of their resolve. Outside the shrine, the scene grew even more desperate. Dancers who couldn't fit inside the chapel flailed on the ground or stumbled in erratic circles. Families wept openly, pleading with the saint for miracles that would not come. The heat bore down, unrelenting, and even the countryside seemed to hold its breath. After hours of ritual, chanting, and attempted purification, the council realized a devastating truth.
the shrine could not cure the mania. The clergy were devastated. Their faces drooped with exhaustion, their hands trembled. Some sank to their knees in prayer, praying not for miracles but for strength to endure the sight of such suffering. As evening descended, the procession began its slow return to Strasbourg, this time not with hope but with sorrow. The dancers were no calmer. If anything, their movements grew more frantic as their bodies strained against the limits of human endurance. Some collapsed repeatedly, needing to be propped or guided by guards unwilling to leave them behind. Others swayed like saplings in strong wind, barely able to sustain the force of their own limbs. By the time they re-entered the city, the sun had set. Shadows stretched across the streets, and the sound of their movements, softened by hours of walking, grew louder again as dancers returned to the familiar rhythm of stone. The pilgrimage had failed, but the journey had done something tragic and irreversible. It spread the fear beyond Strasbourg's walls. Villages along the route whispered that the curse might now travel freely. Some refused to let travelers pass, others abandoned their homes entirely. Strasbourg returned to its nightmare, its citizens slowly realizing they were trapped in a cage, sealed by dread, guided by forces beyond comprehension. The pilgrimage, once a beacon of hope, had become a symbol of despair, and the mania, fed by failure and fear, showed no sign of loosening its grip. The dancers returned to Strasbourg exhausted from the failed pilgrimage, their bodies trembling under a weight far heavier than the heat of the summer sun. But although the journey had drained their strength, the mania did not relent. If anything, the trip seemed to awaken something even darker within the afflicted, an agitation that thrummed beneath the skin, a restless force that refused to be soothed even momentarily. The people who watched them re-enter the city felt the weight of despair settle over their hearts. They had prayed for a miracle at the shrine of St. Vitus. They had begged for divine intervention. They had watched priests sprinkle holy water, press relics against the dancers' chests, and cry out to the heavens. And yet the dancers returned unchanged. Nothing had worked. Faith had not saved them. Music had not saved them. Medicine had not saved them. The city felt as though the very foundations of belief were crumbling. The council, once confident in the guidance of physicians, found its trust eroding. The clergy, once certain of divine explanation, now whispered doubts among themselves. Even the ordinary citizens, who had clung to whatever hope they could find, felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Something was wrong in Strasbourg, something deeper, older, and much more frightening than any explanation offered so far. It was during this climate of uncertainty that the musicians stopped playing. For weeks they had been ordered to provide rhythm for the dancers. At first they had complied out of duty, but as the number of afflicted grew, so did the musicians' fear. They began to dread the square, the sound of their own instruments, the sight of bodies convulsing with increasing ferocity. Many had seen accidents up close, dancers collapsing at their feet, limbs snapping at unnatural angles, blood spraying as exhausted muscles tore apart. The musicians had nightmares in which their drums, flutes, and lutes became instruments of torture rather than healing. Though the council demanded that they continue, the musicians could not ignore the truth that gnawed at them. The more they played, the worse the dancers became. Instead of soothing the afflicted, music intensified their movements. Rhythm fueled frenzy, not relief. And so, one evening at dusk, when the council attempted to gather musicians for another round of performances, only 2 silenced figures appeared, both pale, shaking, and clutching their instruments like burdens rather than tools. The rest had vanished into homes, locked their doors, or fled the city altogether. Word spread quickly among the citizens. The music had died. The moment the truth became known, a hush fell over Strasbourg. It was a silence that felt heavy, like the stillness before a storm. The absence of rhythm, once thought to be the cure, now felt like the loss of a final tether holding the madness at bay. For the dancers, the silence was devastating. Without organized rhythm to guide their movements, their bodies became even more erratic. They twitched and jerked in chaotic spasms, colliding with one another or slamming into walls. Their limbs stretched and writhed as if powered by some wild energy that no longer had direction. Their feet shredded further against the stone, leaving streaks of blood trailing behind them like dark signatures. Some tried to steady themselves by grabbing at anything nearby, barrels, doorways, even passing horses, but their hands slipped, their fingers clawing air. The night the music died was the night the city watched the dancers break. With no rhythm to absorb part of their frenzy, their bodies succumbed rapidly to exhaustion. Dozens collapsed across the square in shaking heaps. Some twitched violently on the ground, legs kicking weakly in the dust before eventually falling still. Others curled into fetal positions, their bodies shivering from exertion, though their toes still tapped involuntarily, a faint echo of the internal rhythm that had consumed them. Families rushed toward the fallen dancers, desperate to help. They lifted limp bodies into their arms, carrying them beneath the shade of nearby archways. But even collapsed, the mania lingered. Limbs jerked unpredictably, forcing caretakers to dodge sudden spasms. Some dancers regained consciousness only to scream in agony, feeling every torn muscle and cracked bone that the dance had inflicted. Meanwhile, crowds formed at a safe distance, their faces twisted with grief and fear. They murmured among themselves, wondering if this was finally the end, if the collapse signaled the mania's retreat. But the priests, standing among the people, shook their heads solemnly. The affliction had not ended, it had merely changed. And indeed, as night deepened, many collapsed dancers began to rise again. Slowly at first, like newborn foals struggling to stand. Their hands pressed unsteadily into the ground, their legs shook violently beneath them. Their heads hung low, hair dripping with sweat. But then the rhythm took hold again, softly at first, like a whisper, and their limbs began to move, jerking them upright. When they rose, the silence around them seemed almost mocking. With no drums, no pipes, no lutes, the dancers moved to a rhythm that no one else could hear. If the mania before had been frightening, this new phase was horrifying.
The movements were more violent than ever, sharp, spasmodic, unpredictable. The dancers thrashed like creatures caught in invisible nets. Their heads snapped from side to side. Their backs arched until their bodies resembled bows drawn to the point of breaking. Their arms flung outward, striking walls and bystanders alike. The square erupted into cries as families scrambled to pull loved ones out of harm's way. But the dancers did not stop, could not stop. Their bodies had become slaves to a force that thrived on chaos. And yet, despite the horror, the city was slowly reaching its limit of fear. For weeks they had trembled, waking each morning to witness more pain than they thought possible. But now, faced with the unbearable sight of movement without music, terror began to transform into something else. Numbness. People watched the dancers with hollow eyes, their emotions drained. They whispered no curses, they offered no theories, they simply observed, as if dissociating from the reality before them was the only way to survive psychologically. The clergy, too, seemed subdued. Their robes hung heavily on their shoulders. Their prayers grew quieter, lacking the conviction they once held. Some priests stared at the dancers with expressions of spiritual defeat. For the first time, they wondered aloud whether this was a trial no human faith could overcome. The physicians grew similarly despondent. Their parchments and ink bottles remained untouched for days. They abandoned attempts to document symptoms or predict outcomes. They no longer argued with the clergy. Their exhaustion had dulled the sharpness of their skepticism. Now they tended only to the dying, offering herbs or poultices not because they believed they would help, but because they could not bear to do nothing. As the days passed, dancers continued to rise and fall.
Their bodies became increasingly frail. Bones protruded beneath torn skin, muscles wasted from constant strain. Some lost consciousness mid-step, crashing violently into the ground. A few simply did not rise again. The sight of death, once shocking, became a grim routine. Families carried away bodies wrapped in cloth, their faces set in masks of quiet mourning. Priests performed hasty rites. The city buried its dead in shallow graves, lacking the energy or resources for ceremony. And still, the rhythm persisted. No one knew how. No one understood why. The city had tried everything: music, pilgrimage, medicine, prayer, and yet the dancers continued, their movements fueled by something deeper than sound or belief.
It was in this bleak landscape of despair that a new idea began to take shape among the council. If the dancers could not be cured, perhaps they could be contained. This thought was dangerous, born of exhaustion and fear, but it grew quickly. Some proposed isolating the dancers in abandoned buildings. Others suggested creating a fenced perimeter outside the city. A few, driven by panic, whispered more brutal solutions. But before any new action could be taken, the final stage of the mania began, a stage that would change Strasbourg forever. Long before Strasbourg trembled beneath the feet of the possessed, Europe had already danced through shadows of the same nightmare. The 1518 outbreak was not born from nothing. It was the latest chapter in a strange and unsettling history that reached back centuries. As fear hollowed Strasbourg from the inside, whispers began spreading that the city was not alone, that other towns had once suffered the same grotesque fate. The stories, once treated as superstition or curiosity, now returned with chilling clarity, like ghosts rising from old graves to remind the living that history had long been haunted by unexplained rhythms. The earliest record came from the year 1021 in a town whose name had faded from memory, leaving behind only fragments of chronicles written by monks who had trembled as they inked the accounts. They described a group of villagers who suddenly began to leap and sway uncontrollably, convulsing in wild paroxysms that seemed guided by neither reason nor sound. The monks wrote of bodies collapsing, limbs twisting, and souls crying out for relief that would not come. They claimed the afflicted were cursed by divine punishment, and though the outbreak eventually faded, the memory lingered with cold unease. In 1237, the town of Erfurt became the stage for another unnatural spectacle. More than 100 children, seized by a frenzy no adult could understand, marched through the streets with arms raised, spinning and trembling as though bewitched. Their tiny feet pounded the dirt roads in frantic unison. Some laughed hysterically, others cried. Many collapsed in exhaustion, only to rise again moments later, compelled to continue the chaotic march. Chroniclers likened the strange procession to the legend of the Pied Piper, as if unseen melodies lured the children toward some unknown fate. Parents ran after them in tears, priests prayed in desperation, but the children did not stop until they reached a neighboring village, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the affliction passed. Just 30 years later, in the summer of 1278, on a bridge over the river Meuse near Maastricht, hundreds were struck by dancing mania so violently that the bridge collapsed beneath them. Chroniclers wrote of bodies tumbling into the river like stones, limbs flailing even as water swallowed them. Survivors described visions of heavenly fire, divine wrath, or strange lights dancing above the river before the frenzy consumed them. The incident carved itself into local memory, resurfacing in songs and poems that treated the tragedy as both curse and divine omen.
The most famous outbreak before Strasbourg occurred in 1374, sweeping across the Rhine Valley with terrifying speed. Cities like Aachen, Cologne, Metz, and Basel struggled to control the masses who fell into violent, uncontrollable dance. Chroniclers from that era documented the chaos with trembling pen strokes, describing men and women who twitched and jerked for days, screaming that invisible forces tormented them. Many claimed demons clutched their limbs. Others believed angels carried them through visions of heaven and hell. Some saw rivers of blood beneath their feet. Others claimed their bodies were lifted by unseen winds. In Aachen, dancers gathered in great throngs, spinning in circles until foam dripped from their mouths. Their feet bled onto the stones, creating gruesome mosaics beneath the summer sun. Priests led processions, carrying relics of Saint Vitus, while families dragged loved ones into churches hoping for miracles. But the mania swept through the city like wildfire, burning itself into collective memory. In Basel, witnesses described dancers collapsing in fields, their limbs still twitching long after consciousness left them. Some fell into convulsions so violent that bones cracked beneath their skin. Even decades after the plague of 1374 ended, its psychological scars remained. Villagers continued to speak of the event with hushed reverence, passing stories from one generation to the next. The very name St. Vitus's dance became synonymous with fear. Wherever a sudden twitch or tremor appeared, people whispered of the mania returning, waiting for chance or sin to unleash it again. These stories resurfaced in Strasbourg with renewed urgency as the dancers multiplied. Older citizens recalled tales their grandparents had told, warnings more than memories, about how quickly hysteria could spread when fear took root. Priests revisited ancient manuscripts, studying the accounts of earlier outbreaks in search of overlooked wisdom. Physicians reviewed old records, though most offered little guidance. Scholars debated whether these past events were connected or merely coincidences scattered across centuries of hardship. Patterns emerged, however, that few could ignore.
Each outbreak had unfolded during moments of immense suffering. Europe in 1021 had been ravaged by famine. In 1237, the Holy Roman Empire was tangled in political turmoil. The 1278 tragedy occurred during economic hardship, and the 1374 explosion of mania came in the wake of the Black Death, a catastrophe that had shattered the continent's stability and left survivors emotionally drained. The outbreaks often struck communities under immense stress, where fear and hunger gnawed at minds already weakened by grief. Strasbourg in 1518 fit the pattern perfectly. Famine stalked the city, disease threatened, the summer brought unbearable heat, taxes crushed the poor, the shadow of war loomed nearby. The citizens were stretched thin mentally, spiritually, and physically. If the past taught anything, it was that extreme suffering created fertile ground for hysteria. But there was more. Many earlier outbreaks shared another unsettling detail. The afflicted often described hearing music no one else could hear. Chroniclers mentioned invisible melodies, phantom rhythms that guided the dancers. In Aachen, witnesses said the dancers spun as though accompanied by the faint strains of celestial instruments. In Erfurt, children marched with uncanny synchronization, as though following a drum beat that echoed only in their minds. This unnerved Strasbourg scholars, who realized their dancers too moved to a rhythm unheard by others. The outsiders saw chaos, but the afflicted reacted with a strange unity, as though their limbs were following commands whispered directly into their minds. Also troubling was the fact that many outbreaks ended only after enormous physical or emotional collapse. Some dancers simply dropped dead. Others became so exhausted that their bodies refused to continue. Only after the afflicted reached total depletion did the mania sometimes pass.
In several recorded cases, survivors later spoke of waking from the frenzy with no memory of their movements, as if possessed by something that left once the body could give no more. These similarities, far too numerous to dismiss, painted a grim picture. The dancing mania was not a random occurrence. It was a recurring phenomenon, cyclical, mysterious, shaped by human suffering and frighteningly consistent across centuries. Yet despite the patterns, no chronicler had ever uncovered a cause. Physicians blamed the body, clergy blamed the soul, common people blamed spirits, curses, or unseen winds.
Scholars suggested mass psychosis, an invisible storm of fear that could sweep through tightly wound communities. But nothing fully explained why bodies moved so violently for so long, or why some people were affected while others remained untouched. As Strasbourg's situation worsened, comparisons to past outbreaks became more frequent. Citizens clung to the stories like grim prophecies. Many believed that the dancing would finally stop only when enough dancers collapsed from exhaustion. Others feared the outbreak would spread to neighboring towns, repeating the tragedies of 1374. Priests warned that ignoring the lessons of the past risked inviting greater spiritual wrath. And so the past haunted the present. Strasbourg felt not like a city facing a singular crisis, but like the next link in a long, dark chain stretching back through generations. Each echo from history reminded the people that they were not witnessing something new. They were reliving a curse that Europe seemed destined to face again and again. The more citizens learned of earlier outbreaks, the more they wondered whether the mania was woven into the fabric of human nature itself. Perhaps it was always waiting beneath the surface, dormant until fear, hunger, and despair created the perfect storm. Perhaps invisible threads connected each outbreak across time, binding them in a shared ancient mystery. As the dancers continued their endless torment, as limbs cracked and hearts faltered, Strasbourg finally understood. If countless cities before had been unable to escape the mania, what hope did they have? The past had returned, and soon the darkest days of Strasbourg's own nightmare would reach their peak. As August crept over Strasbourg, the city had begun to resemble a place caught between life and death, neither fully abandoned nor truly inhabited. The dancers who still moved through its squares had been reduced to fragmented shadows of mankind, bodies propelled by a force that lingered between exhaustion and oblivion. Yet amid the growing stillness, amid the smell of sweat and dust that clung to the streets, a sobering realization settled upon the city. The madness was finally beginning to ebb. Not suddenly, not dramatically, not with a miracle or divine proclamation, but slowly, so slowly that, at first, no one dared even whisper the possibility. The first sign came when a dancer collapsed in the market square and did not rise again. Those nearby braced for the familiar twitch, the sudden jerk of limbs, the invisible force dragging the body upright. But it did not happen. The dancer lay still, chest heaving shallowly, limbs limp with exhaustion. Priests rushed to the scene, sprinkling holy water, convinced the stillness indicated death. But when the dancer's eyelids fluttered weakly, they realized it was not death that had claimed them. It was rest. Real rest. Human rest. It was the first glimmer of hope Strasbourg had seen in weeks. Within hours, more dancers began to collapse and remain down. Some were carried into shaded alcoves by trembling families, unsure whether to celebrate or mourn. Others were left where they fell, their bodies simply too heavy to move. Physicians cautiously approached them, examining pulse, breath, the tremble of fatigued muscles. Their conclusions were uncertain, but hopeful. The mania was dulling, its grip weakening. The invisible rhythm that had controlled the afflicted was fading. But the city, ravaged by fear and death, did not celebrate, not yet. They had been deceived before, moments of quiet followed by surges of frenzy. They held their breath,
watching carefully for signs the dance would resume. In some cases, it did. A collapsed dancer would lie still for an hour or two before limbs twitched violently and the body sprang back into motion. It was a sickening sight, one that shattered fragile hope. But even in these cases, the duration of movement was shorter, the intensity weaker. The mania seemed to be losing its strength, like a storm losing wind. By the second week of August, fewer dancers remained upright. Their movements, once wild and violent, had become sluggish. Legs dragged rather than kicked. Arms fluttered weakly instead of flailing with demonic vigor. Some dancers appeared conscious again, their eyes focusing on their surroundings with confusion and terror. They had no memory of the past weeks. Their minds were blank pages where pain, fear, and exhaustion lingered without context. For the first time in weeks, the sound of pounding feet began to fade. Strasbourg's citizens dared to walk the streets again, slowly, cautiously, like timid animals emerging from burrows after a long and dangerous night. They watched the remaining dancers with wary eyes, but the frenzy no longer seemed contagious. The fear no longer held the city by the throat. The rhythm had weakened to a faint echo.
The mania's decline baffled both physicians and clergy. Neither side could claim victory. Neither cure nor prayer had stopped the madness. It had simply run its course, burned itself out. Like a fever breaking, like a fire that consumed all its fuel, the mania had exhausted its own energy. But its shadow remained. The physical suffering was immense. Dancers collapsed with tendons torn, bones fractured, and muscles shredded. Many were carried into makeshift wards where physicians tended to wounds with grim determination. More than a few would never walk properly again. Yet the emotional toll was far worse. Families had been shattered. Children had witnessed horrors no young mind should endure. Fear had twisted the city into something cold and unfamiliar. Even as normal life slowly trickled back into the streets, a strange quiet lingered, a silence born not of peace, but of trauma. People spoke of the outbreak in hushed tones, as though naming it aloud might summon its return. Priests held masses for the dead and the recovered, but their sermons felt thin, stretched over wounds too deep for words. They blessed the survivors, yet their hands trembled with doubt. For weeks they had prayed, and yet the frenzy had ignored their pleas. The clergy's faith had not shattered, but it had cracked, leaving questions no scripture could answer. Physicians fared no better. Their theories about overheated blood felt foolish now, their treatments useless. Many were haunted by guilt, knowing they had insisted on music and movement that worsened the suffering. Their confidence, once bolstered by ancient medical texts, now felt fragile. They turned their attention to the survivors, hoping that healing broken bodies might ease the burden of failure. Scholars approached the mania with renewed curiosity. They collected testimonies, studied past outbreaks, and attempted to catalog every detail. Some believed the event was psychological, a mass eruption of hysteria fueled by famine, fear, and desperation. Others attributed it to environmental causes, toxic grains, fungal spores, contaminated water. A handful whispered darker theories, unseen forces, curses, spiritual echoes from past tragedies. But none could answer the most unsettling question. Why did the mania stop? There was no clear endpoint, no trigger, no intervention. It faded on its own, as mysteriously as it had begun. And this mystery unsettled historians for centuries to come. As Strasbourg healed, the dancers themselves faced a cruel aftermath. Many woke from their delirium with fractured memories, images of fire, shadowy figures, or twisting paths covered in blood. They remembered nothing of their actual movements, but their dreams were plagued by visions of being pulled by invisible hands. Some suffered trembling fits long after the mania ended. Others sank into deep melancholy, unable to reconcile the blank space in their memory with the bruises and scars that covered their bodies. Families protected the survivors fiercely, shielding them from the stares and whispers of those who came to gawk.
Although the mania had left the city, the stigma lingered like a stain. Some believed the dancers had been personally cursed. Others suspected demonic influence still lingered within them, and so a quiet divide formed between those who had danced and those who had merely watched. Strasbourg's leaders attempted to restore normalcy. Markets reopened, bells rang again, children returned to play in streets once filled with writhing bodies. Slowly, life resumed its rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted in the city's psyche. Fear had carved itself into the bones of Strasbourg, leaving a legacy that no amount of time could fully erase. In the years that followed, the dancing mania of 1518 became a whispered legend. Chroniclers documented it with trembling pens. Travelers carried the story to distant villages. Artists depicted the dancers with contorted limbs and haunted faces. Scholars dissected the event in treatises and lectures, and generations grew up hearing warnings of the summer when bodies moved without will, when fear became rhythm, and when the boundary between sanity and madness dissolved under the weight of collective despair. But the mania did not vanish from Europe entirely. In later centuries, similar outbreaks occurred, though smaller and less intense. Children fell into trembling trances, groups convulsed without warning, isolated villages claimed spirits had danced through their streets. None reached the scale of 1518, but all echoed its shadow. Modern theories eventually replaced medieval ones. Scientists pointed to mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon where extreme stress causes physical symptoms to spread rapidly through communities. Psychologists highlighted the role of fear, famine, and trauma. Biologists studied ergot fungus, which grows on damp rye and can induce hallucinations, spasms, and convulsions, symptoms eerily similar to those of the mania. Historians noted that such outbreaks often occurred during times of extreme hardship, when societies stood on the brink of collapse. Perhaps the mania was a psychological wildfire.
Perhaps it was poisoning. Perhaps it was spiritual. Or perhaps it was all of these at once, a convergence of physical suffering, emotional despair, and cultural belief that shaped the human mind into something fragile, volatile, and uncontrollable. Yet the truth remained elusive, hidden behind layers of time, fear, and interpretation. Strasbourg never forgot the summer of 1518. The memory lingered in its stones, in its stories, in the quiet ways people avoided discussing anything that resembled the movements of that cursed dance. It lingered in the tremble of elders who lived through the event, and in the silence passed down to children long after the dancers' footsteps had faded. And even today, centuries later, the dancing plague continues to fascinate and terrify. It stands as a reminder that the human mind, under pressure, can fracture in extraordinary ways, that fear can become contagious, that suffering can manifest in physical torment, and that unseen forces within society can shape behavior beyond rational explanation. The shadow of the mania never fully left Europe. It lingers still in our collective memory, a ghostly echo of a rhythm no one could hear, yet everyone feared. And somewhere between history and legend, between science and superstition, the dancers of Strasbourg continue their silent, eternal dance, forever trapped in the haunting story of a summer when Europe lost control.